Lieutenant Sarah stepped off the transport helicopter onto the dusty training ground of Naval Special Warfare Center. The rotor blades created a whirlwind of sand and debris around her as she grabbed her gear bag and walked toward the main compound. At 26, she was one of the first women to be assigned as a combat instructor to the elite SEAL training facility in California. The morning sun cast long shadows across the obstacle course where dozens of SEAL trainees were already pushing through their daily physical training routine. Sarah could feel hundreds of eyes watching her every move as she made her way to the administrative building. Some looks were curious, others skeptical, and a few openly hostile. Sarah had earned her place here through years of dedication and exceptional performance. She held a black belt in Brazilian and had competed internationally in mixed martial arts before joining the Navy. Her military record was spotless, with commendations for her work as a combat instructor at other bases. But none of that seemed to matter to the men who saw her as an outsider invading their exclusive brotherhood. Commander James met her at the entrance to the building. He was a seasoned SEAL officer with 20 years of experience and scars that told stories of countless missions in hostile territories. His weathered face showed neither approval nor disapproval as he shook her hand with a firm grip. "Lieutenant, welcome to. I hope you're ready for what lies ahead. Training SEALs isn't like anything you've done before. These men are pushed to their absolute limits, and they expect the same level of excellence from their instructors." His voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded respect in the most dangerous situations imaginable. Sarah nodded confidently. "I understand, sir. I'm here to do my job and help train the best operators the Navy has to offer." As they walked through the facility, explained her duties. She would be responsible for teaching hand-to-hand combat techniques, close-quarters battle tactics, and physical conditioning. The SEAL candidates she would train were already among the military's elite, having survived the initial screening process that eliminated 90% of applicants. "You'll be working with Class 347, continued. "They're in their 14th week of training, so they've already been through Hell Week and are in the advanced phases. These men have proven they have what it takes to become SEALs, but they still have a lot to learn." They stopped outside a large training facility where the sounds of intense physical training echoed through the corridors. Through the windows, Sarah could see muscular men in green military uniforms practicing various combat techniques under the watchful eyes of instructors. "I won't lie to you, Lieutenant. There's been resistance to having a female instructor here. Some of the men question whether a woman can effectively train future SEALs. You're going to have to prove yourself every single day." His tone was matter-of-fact, neither encouraging nor discouraging. Sarah had expected this. Throughout her military career, she had faced similar challenges. Every new assignment meant proving herself all over again to people who doubted her capabilities based solely on her gender. But she had never backed down from a challenge, and she wasn't about to start now. "I understand the situation, sir. I've dealt with similar attitudes before. I'll let my performance speak for itself." Smiled slightly, the first hint of approval she had seen from him. "That's exactly what I was hoping to hear. Your first class is at 800 tomorrow. Get some rest and be ready to work." That evening, Sarah unpacked her belongings in the small apartment she had been assigned on base. As she organized her gear, she thought about the challenge ahead. She knew that earning respect from the SEAL candidates would require more than just demonstrating her knowledge and skills. She would need to prove that she belonged among the elite warriors who called this place home. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the training facility 30 minutes early. She wanted to observe the candidates before introducing herself, to get a sense of their personalities and group dynamics. Through the observation window, she watched as 25 men went through their morning physical training routine. They moved with the precision and intensity that marked elite military units. Every exercise was executed with perfect form, every command followed without hesitation. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were men who had already proven their exceptional physical and mental capabilities through months of grueling training. At exactly 800, Sarah entered the training room. The candidates immediately snapped to attention, their eyes fixed straight ahead in perfect military bearing. But she could sense the tension in the air, the unspoken questions about what this small woman could possibly teach them about combat. "Good morning, I'm Lieutenant, and I'll be your close-quarters combat instructor for the remainder of your training cycle." Her voice carried clearly across the room, projecting confidence and authority despite her relatively small stature compared to the imposing men before her. Today we're going to focus on hand-to-hand combat techniques that could save your life in situations where weapons aren't available or practical. These skills have been tested in real combat situations and have proven effective against larger, stronger opponents. She began the lesson by demonstrating basic techniques on a practice dummy, explaining the principles of leverage, timing, and precision that made small-frame fighters effective against larger opponents. Her movements were fluid and precise, each technique executed with the kind of muscle memory that comes from years of dedicated practice. Combat isn't about being the biggest or strongest person in the fight. It's about using your opponent's strength and momentum against them while exploiting their weaknesses and vulnerabilities. As she spoke, she noticed several candidates exchanging glances and subtle smirks. She could read their thoughts as clearly as if they had spoken aloud. They were thinking that her techniques might work against untrained civilians, but not against elite warriors like themselves. One candidate in particular seemed especially skeptical. Petty Officer was a mountain of a man, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with the kind of muscled build that came from years of intense physical training. His arms were as thick as most men's legs, and his chest strained against his military uniform. Had been a college football player before joining the Navy, and his physical dominance had carried him through SEAL training with relative ease. He had never encountered a physical challenge he couldn't overcome through sheer strength and determination. "Now I need a volunteer to help demonstrate these techniques," Sarah announced, scanning the room for someone to assist with the demonstration. His hand shot up immediately. "I volunteer, ma'am." His tone was respectful on the surface, but Sarah detected an underlying challenge in his words. As stepped forward, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The other candidates sensed that something significant was about to happen. This wasn't just a routine training demonstration anymore. It was a test of their new instructor's credibility and capability. Sarah sized up her volunteer as he approached, outweighed her by at least 100 pounds and had a significant reach advantage. In a test of pure strength, there would be no contest, but Sarah had learned long ago that fights were rarely won by strength alone. "Excellent, Petty Officer. We're going to demonstrate a basic defensive technique against a larger attacker. I want you to attempt to grab me in a bear hug from the front, using your full strength." Nodded, a confident smile playing at the corners of his mouth. In his mind, this would be a simple matter of showing the other candidates that their instructor's techniques might look impressive in theory, but wouldn't work against a real opponent. As moved toward her, Sarah's mind shifted into the focused state she had developed through years of competitive fighting. Time seemed to slow down as she analyzed her opponent's movement, looking for the optimal moment to execute her counter-technique. The room fell silent as the two warriors faced each other, the outcome of their encounter about to determine the respect and authority Sarah would command for the remainder of her assignment. Stepped forward with the confidence of a man who had never lost a physical confrontation. His massive frame cast a shadow over Sarah as he positioned himself for what he assumed would be an easy demonstration of superior strength. The other SEAL candidates formed a loose circle around them, their eyes fixed on the unfolding scene with intense interest. "Remember, Petty Officer, this is a training exercise. Use controlled force, but make it realistic enough to demonstrate the technique's effectiveness," Sarah instructed, her voice calm and professional despite the obvious physical mismatch. Nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't planning to go easy on her. In his mind, this was an opportunity to prove that physical reality trumped theoretical knowledge. He had seen too many instructors who could talk a good game but couldn't back it up when challenged by real operators. As began his approach, Sarah noticed the subtle signs that revealed his intentions. His shoulders were tense, his stance wider than necessary for a controlled demonstration. He wasn't just planning to grab her, he was planning to overpower her and prove a point to his fellow candidates. "Here I come, ma'am," announced, his voice carrying a hint of smugness that didn't go unnoticed by the observing candidates. Lunged forward, his massive arms reaching out to envelop Sarah in what would have been a crushing bear hug. But Sarah had anticipated his movement, reading his body language like a book written in a language she had studied for years. Just as his arms were about to close around her, Sarah stepped slightly to her left and ducked under his right arm. Her movement was so fluid and precise that it seemed almost choreographed. Before could adjust his momentum, Sarah had slipped behind him and secured a rear naked choke hold. The technique happened so quickly that most of the candidates missed the specific details of how Sarah had gained her advantageous position. One moment was reaching for her with obvious confidence, and the next moment Sarah was behind him with her arm wrapped around his thick neck. But wasn't finished. His pride wouldn't allow him to submit to what he viewed as a lucky escape. Using his superior strength, he grabbed Sarah's arm and attempted to throw her over his shoulder. His plan was to use his size and power to break her hold and regain control of the situation. Sarah felt muscles tense as he prepared to use brute force to escape her position. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the opportunity to demonstrate that technique and timing could overcome raw physical power. As began to bend forward to execute his throw, Sarah released her choke hold and used his own momentum against him. She placed her right hand on his back and her left hand on his shoulder, guiding his movement while simultaneously sweeping his legs with her right foot. Found himself airborne for a brief moment before crashing to the mat with a thunderous impact that echoed through the training facility. The combination of his own forward momentum and Sarah's perfectly timed technique had sent all 220 pounds of him flying through the air. The candidates watched in stunned silence as their massive teammate lay on the mat, temporarily winded from his unexpected flight. Wasn't injured, but his pride had taken a significant blow. He had been completely outmaneuvered by someone half his size. Sarah stood calmly over, not gloating or showing any sign of satisfaction. Her professional demeanor remained unchanged, as if throwing a man twice her size was just another routine part of her job. The key to that technique is using your opponent's momentum and aggression against them. The harder they come at you, the more force you have to redirect, she explained to the class as slowly got back to his feet. His face was flushed, partly from exertion but mostly from embarrassment. He couldn't believe what had just happened. In his world, size and strength always won. The idea that a small woman could physically dominate him challenged everything he believed about combat and competition. "Let's try that again," said, his voice tight with determination. "I wasn't ready for that technique. Now that I know what to expect, it won't work again." Sarah raised an eyebrow. This wasn't supposed to be a competition, but was clearly making it personal. She could see the frustration and wounded pride in his eyes, and she knew that backing down now would undermine her authority with the entire class. "Petty officer, this is a demonstration, not a contest. The purpose is to teach technique, not to prove dominance," Sarah replied, giving him an opportunity to back down gracefully. "I understand that, ma'am, but I think it's important for the class to see how these techniques work against someone who's prepared for them. Real enemies won't be caught off guard like I was." The other candidates sensed the tension building between their instructor and their teammate. This had evolved beyond a simple training exercise into something much more significant. The outcome would determine not just Sarah's credibility as an instructor, but also the candidate's respect for her authority. Sarah realized she was at a crossroads. If she refused challenge, some of the candidates might interpret it as a sign that her initial success was just luck. But if she accepted and lost, her authority would be completely undermined. "Very well, petty officer, but this time we'll make it more realistic. Instead of a controlled demonstration, you can use whatever technique you think will be most effective. Treat this as if it were a real combat situation." Smiled grimly. This was what he had been hopping for. Now he could use his full strength and show these men that their instructor's parlor tricks wouldn't work against a serious opponent who wasn't holding back. "Rules are simple," Sarah announced to the class. "Petty officer will attempt to subdue me using any non-lethal technique he chooses. I'll defend myself using the principles we've been discussing. The encounter ends when one of us achieves a submission hold or a position of clear dominance." Cracked his knuckles and rolled his shoulders, preparing for what he was certain would be his redemption. He had learned from his previous mistake and wouldn't be caught off guard again. This time, he would use his strength systematically and methodically, giving Sarah no opportunity to use his momentum against him. The candidates formed a wider circle, giving the two combatants more room to maneuver. The atmosphere in the room had become electric with anticipation. Everyone understood that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Sarah assumed a relaxed fighting stance, her hands up but not aggressive, her weight evenly distributed on both feet. She appeared calm and focused, showing no signs of nervousness despite facing an opponent who could probably bench press her body weight. Approached more cautiously this time, his movements controlled and deliberate. He had decided to use his wrestling background to take Sarah to the ground, where his size and strength advantages would be most pronounced. He shot in low, attempting to grab Sarah's legs for a takedown, but Sarah had anticipated this approach and was ready for it. As reached for her legs, she sprawled backward, using her hands to push down on his head while simultaneously stepping her legs back out of his reach. Found himself face down on the mat with Sarah controlling his head and shoulders from above. He tried to power his way back to his feet, but Sarah maintained her dominant position by constantly adjusting her weight and pressure. Growing frustrated, attempted to roll over onto his back, hopping to use his leg strength to push Sarah away. But as he began to turn, Sarah smoothly transitioned to a side control position, using her body weight to pin his shoulder to the mat. The key principle here is maintaining positional control, Sarah explained to the class while still controlling. Size and strength don't matter if your opponent can't effectively use them. His breathing was becoming labored from his struggles to escape Sarah's control. Every time he tried to use his strength to power out of her holds, she would adjust her position and use leverage to maintain her advantage. After several minutes of fruitless struggle, was beginning to realize that brute force wouldn't be enough to overcome his instructor's technical superiority. But his pride still wouldn't allow him to give up. He was determined to prove that a woman couldn't physically dominate him, regardless of her training and technique. That's when made the decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to struggle within the rules of their sparring session, he decided to escalate to actual violence. His frustration had reached a boiling point. Every technique he had relied on throughout his military career was being neutralized by Sarah's superior positioning and leverage. His face was red from exertion and embarrassment as he realized that half the SEAL class was watching him being dominated by a woman who weighed barely half what he did. In his mounting anger, forgot that this was supposed to be a training exercise between professionals. His ego couldn't accept what was happening, and his rational judgment began to cloud over with rage and wounded pride. While Sarah maintained her side control position, explaining defensive concepts to the observing candidates, saw his opportunity. When Sarah shifted slightly to address the class, used his superior reach to grab her wrist with his massive hand. "You want to see some real technique?" snarled, his voice filled with venom that made several candidates step back in alarm. Before Sarah could react, yanked her arm violently while simultaneously bucking his hips upward with all his strength. The sudden burst of aggression caught Sarah off balance and managed to reverse their positions, ending up on top with Sarah pinned beneath his considerable weight. But wasn't satisfied with simply escaping her control. His pride demanded complete dominance, a clear demonstration that his physical superiority trumped her technical skills. With Sarah momentarily stunned by his sudden escalation, drew back his right fist and prepared to strike her face with full force. "This is what happens when you try to embarrass me in front of my brothers," shouted, his voice echoing off the walls of the training facility. The SEAL candidates watching the encounter realized immediately that something had gone terribly wrong. This was no longer a training exercise or even competitive sparring. Was about to seriously assault their instructor, and his size advantage meant he could cause severe injury with a single punch. Several candidates started to move forward to intervene, but they were too far away to prevent what was about to happen. His fist was already in motion, driving downward with enough force to break bones and potentially cause permanent damage. But Sarah hadn't survived years of competitive mixed martial arts fighting without learning how to handle desperate opponents who resorted to violence when their skills proved inadequate. Even with weight pinning her to the mat, she maintained the mental clarity and physical conditioning that had made her a champion fighter. As fist descended toward her face, Sarah executed a perfectly timed bridge and roll technique. She thrust her hips upward while simultaneously grabbing Sgi with both hands and pulling him forward over her head. Committed to his punch and caught off balance by Sarah's sudden movement, found himself flying through the air once again. But this time, his landing was far more dramatic and decisive than his previous fall. Sarah had used his own momentum and the force of his attempted punch to launch him over her head and onto his back. The combination of his forward momentum and the rotational force from her bridge technique sent him crashing to the mat with devastating impact. The sound of hitting the floor was like a thunderclap in the suddenly silent training room. His massive frame struck the mat with such force that dust particles rose from the impact point, and the vibration could be felt through the floor by candidates standing 20 feet away. Lay motionless on his back, his eyes closed and his body completely relaxed. The violent attempt to punch his instructor had backfired spectacularly, leaving him unconscious on the training room floor. Sarah rolled smoothly to her feet, her breathing barely elevated despite the intense physical confrontation she had just survived. She looked down at its unconscious form with a mixture of professional concern and justified satisfaction. The 24 other SEAL candidates stood in absolute silence, processing what they had just witnessed. Their massive teammate, a man who had dominated every physical challenge throughout their training, lay unconscious after being thrown by a woman who barely came up to his chest. "Is he okay?" asked Petty Officer, breaking the stunned silence that had fallen over the room. Sarah knelt beside and checked his pulse and breathing. Her medical training kicked in as she assessed his condition with the same professional competence she had demonstrated throughout the confrontation. "He's fine, just unconscious from the impact. He'll wake up in a few minutes with nothing worse than a headache and some bruised pride." Sarah's voice carried no emotion, as if dealing with unconscious attackers was just another routine part of her job. She stood up and looked around the circle of candidates, meeting each man's eyes with steady confidence. The doubt and skepticism she had seen when she first entered the room had been completely replaced with respect and amazement. "What you just witnessed demonstrates several important combat principles that could save your lives in the field. First, never let emotion override your tactical judgment." Petty Officer allowed his anger to cloud his decision-making, which led to poor technique and ultimately his defeat. Sarah walked slowly around his unconscious form as she continued her impromptu lesson. Second, size and strength mean nothing if you can't control your opponent's movement. Combat is about position, timing, and leverage, not about who can lift the most weight in the gym. She paused and looked directly at the candidates who had seemed most skeptical of her appointment as their instructor. Third, never underestimate an opponent based on their appearance. The enemy won't always look like what you expect, and making assumptions about someone's capabilities can get you killed. Began to stir, his eyes fluttering open as consciousness slowly returned. He looked around in confusion, trying to remember where he was and what had happened. The last thing he clearly recalled was drawing back his fist to punch Sarah in the face. "Take it easy, Petty Officer. You took a hard fall, but you're going to be fine," Sarah said, her voice showing genuine concern for his well-being despite the fact that he had just tried to assault her. Slowly sat up, his hand moving to the back of his head where a lump was already forming. The fog in his mind began to clear, and the full impact of what had happened started to register. He had attacked an instructor during a training exercise and ended up unconscious on the floor in front of his entire class. Not only had he embarrassed himself, but he had also violated military protocol and probably destroyed his chances of completing SEAL training. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I don't know what came over me. I lost my temper and acted unprofessionally," said, his voice barely above a whisper as shame washed over him. Sarah extended her hand to help him to his feet. "We all make mistakes, Petty Officer. The important thing is learning from them and moving forward as better warriors and better men." Accepted her assistance and stood up slowly, testing his balance and making sure he wasn't seriously injured. The other candidates watched this interaction with fascination, surprised by their instructor's grace and professionalism in handling someone who had just tried to harm her. "However," Sarah continued, her tone becoming more serious, "what happened here cannot happen again. Attacking an instructor is a serious violation of military discipline and SEAL standards. I'm going to recommend that you receive additional training in anger management and professional conduct." Nodded acceptance of his punishment. He knew he was lucky to still be in the SEAL program at all. In many military units, attacking an instructor would result in immediate dismissal and possibly criminal charges. The training room door opened, and Commander entered with two other SEAL instructors. They had heard the commotion and come to investigate what was happening in Sarah's class. "Is everything under control here, Lieutenant?" asked, his experienced eyes quickly taking in the scene and assessing the situation. "Yes, sir. We had a training incident, but it's been resolved. Petty officer will need to see the medical staff to make sure he doesn't have a concussion, but otherwise everyone is fine." Looked at its disheveled appearance and the respectful way the other candidates were watching Sarah, and he quickly understood what had happened. He had seen similar situations before when new instructors had to prove themselves to skeptical students. "Very well. Carry on with your class, Lieutenant. Petty officer, report to medical immediately for evaluation, then report to my office at 1400 hours." As left the room with one of the assistant instructors, Sarah turned back to address her remaining students. The atmosphere had completely changed from the skeptical tension that had existed an hour earlier. Word of what had happened in Lieutenant's class spread through the Naval Special Warfare Center like wildfire. By lunchtime, every instructor, support staff member, and SEAL candidate on the base had heard some version of the story about the female instructor who had knocked out a massive candidate with a single throw. The story grew with each telling, as military stories often do. Some versions had flying 20 feet through the air before hitting the ground. Others claimed Sarah had used some kind of secret martial arts technique that was banned in professional fighting. But the core facts remained consistent. A small woman had decisively defeated a much larger man who had foolishly escalated a training exercise into actual violence. Sarah spent her lunch break in the instructor's lounge, reviewing training materials for her afternoon classes. She was surprised when Commander approached her table with his own lunch tray and asked if he could join her. "I've been getting reports about what happened in your class this morning," said as he sat down. "From what I understand, you handled a difficult situation with exactly the kind of professionalism we expect from our instructors." Sarah looked up from her notes. "Petty officer made a mistake, but he's a good candidate overall. I hope this incident won't derail his training permanently." Smiled. "That's exactly the attitude I was hoping to hear. Is meeting with the command psychologist this afternoon to discuss what happened and why. Assuming he takes responsibility for his actions and demonstrates he's learned from the experience, he'll be allowed to continue with the program." "I'm glad to hear that, sir. He has the physical capabilities and determination to be an excellent SEAL. He just needs to learn to control his emotions and work as part of a team. Speaking of which, I understand the other candidates in your class have had a significant change in attitude since this morning's demonstration." Sarah nodded. "They've been very respectful and attentive. I think they understand now that effective combat techniques aren't about size and strength alone." What Sarah didn't mention was how dramatically the entire dynamic of her classes had changed. The skeptical looks and subtle resistance she had faced from the candidates that morning had been completely replaced with genuine respect and eagerness to learn. During her afternoon hand-to-hand combat class, the same candidates who had questioned her credibility were now hanging on her every word. They asked detailed questions about technique, requested additional demonstrations, and volunteered enthusiastically for training exercises. "Ma'am, could you show us that throw you used on?" asked Petty Officer Davis, one of the candidates who had been most openly skeptical that morning. "That technique is called a bridge and roll, and it's particularly effective when an opponent tries to strike you from a mounted position. The key is using their forward momentum against them while creating enough space to reverse your positions." Sarah demonstrated the technique slowly with another volunteer, explaining each component of the movement and the principles that made it effective. The candidates watched with intense concentration, taking mental notes on every detail. The most important aspect isn't the physical technique itself, but the mental state that allows you to execute it under pressure. When someone is trying to hurt you, your natural instinct is to panic or try to match their aggression with more aggression. But that usually leads to poor decision-making and tactical mistakes. She paused to make sure she had everyone's attention. Combat effectiveness comes from maintaining mental clarity even in the most stressful situations. That clarity allows you to see opportunities that aggressive opponents miss because they're focused on overpowering rather than outthinking their enemies. The afternoon progressed with the candidates displaying a level of attention and respect that Sarah had rarely experienced as an instructor. They were genuinely interested in learning from someone who had proven her combat effectiveness in the most dramatic way possible. During a break between exercises, Petty Officer Martinez approached Sarah privately. Martinez was one of the quieter candidates, but Sarah had noticed that the other men looked up to him as an informal leader. "Ma'am, I wanted to apologize for the way some of us acted this morning. We should have shown you more respect from the beginning, regardless of our personal opinions about women in combat roles." Sarah appreciated his honesty. "I understand the position you were all in, Petty Officer Martinez. You're training to join one of the military's most elite units, and you want to be confident that your instructors can teach you skills that might save your lives in real combat situations." "Yes, ma'am, but we were judging you based on stereotypes rather than giving you a fair chance to prove your capabilities. That was unprofessional and wrong. The important thing is that you're willing to learn and adapt. That flexibility and openness to new ideas will serve you well as a SEAL operator." Martinez nodded. "The guys and I have been talking, and we want you to know that we're committed to giving you our best effort from now on. What you did this morning showed us that we still have a lot to learn about combat effectiveness." Word of the morning's events had also reached other parts of the base. During her evening meal in the officers' dining facility, Sarah was approached by several veteran SEAL instructors who wanted to congratulate her on how she had handled the situation. "I heard tried to take your head off and ended up taking a nap instead," said Chief Petty Officer Williams, a grizzled veteran with 30 years of special operations experience. "That's the kind of lesson that sticks with a class for the rest of their careers." Another instructor, Lieutenant Commander Brooks, joined the conversation. "I've been teaching SEALs for 15 years, and I've never seen a group of candidates show so much respect for an instructor after just one day. Whatever you did in that classroom, it worked." Sarah was grateful for the support from her fellow instructors, but she knew that one successful demonstration wouldn't be enough to establish long-term credibility. She would need to continue proving herself every day through consistent professionalism and excellent instruction. The next morning, Sarah arrived early to prepare for another day of classes. She was surprised to find Petty Officer waiting outside her classroom, looking embarrassed but determined. "Ma'am, I wanted to speak with you privately before class starts," said, his voice showing genuine remorse. "Of course, Petty Officer. How are you feeling after yesterday's incident?" "Physically, I'm fine, just a headache and some bruised ego, but I wanted to apologize for my behavior. What I did was completely inappropriate and dangerous. You could have been seriously injured because of my lack of self-control." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus empty words meant to avoid punishment. What she saw was a young man who was genuinely ashamed of his actions and committed to making amends. "I appreciate your apology, Petty Officer. What's more important is what you've learned from the experience and how you plan to conduct yourself going forward. I've learned that my pride and assumptions almost cost me my SEAL training and could have seriously hurt someone who was trying to help me become a better operator. I've also learned that physical strength means nothing without mental discipline and respect for others." Paused, clearly struggling with his next words. "I've also learned that I have some serious issues with anger and control that I need to address. The command psychologist is helping me develop strategies for managing my emotions under stress. Those are all important realizations, and I'm glad you're taking responsibility for your actions. The ability to recognize and correct your weaknesses is what separates good operators from great ones. Ma'am, I know I don't deserve it, but I was hoping you might give me another chance to prove that I can be a professional student in your classes. I promise you won't have any more problems with me." Sarah considered his request carefully, had shown genuine remorse, and seemed committed to changing his behavior. More importantly, giving him a second chance would demonstrate to the other candidates that she was fair and willing to work with students who made honest mistakes. "Everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes, Petty Officer. You're welcome back in my classes, but you'll be held to the same high standards as everyone else. Any future incidents will result in your immediate removal from the program." Relief was visible on his face. "Thank you, ma'am. You won't regret this decision." As the rest of the candidates arrived for the morning class, Sarah noticed the change in group dynamics. Took a position in the back of the formation, clearly humbled by his experience but still committed to completing his training. The other candidates showed a level of attention and respect that exceeded even the previous afternoon. They had seen their instructor's technical skills, physical courage, and professional grace under pressure. More importantly, they had seen her willingness to give a second chance to someone who had made a serious mistake. Good morning. Today we're going to work on defensive techniques against multiple attackers. These skills could mean the difference between life and death when you're outnumbered in hostile territory. As Sarah began the lesson, she reflected on how much had changed in just 24 hours. She had arrived at the Naval Special Warfare Center as an outsider who would need to prove herself to skeptical students. Through a combination of technical skill, mental toughness, and professional leadership, she had not only earned their respect, but had also helped a troubled candidate learn important lessons about self-control and teamwork. 3 months later, Class 347 was preparing for their graduation ceremony. The 25 candidates who had started Sarah's first class had all successfully completed their SEAL training, including Petty Officer, who had become one of the most improved students in the program. Sarah stood at the back of the graduation ceremony, watching as the new SEALs received their trident pins from senior officers. The pride she felt wasn't just professional satisfaction at completing another successful training cycle. It was the deeper fulfillment that came from knowing she had helped shape the character and capabilities of America's most elite warriors. Commander approached her during the ceremony. "Lieutenant, I wanted to personally thank you for the outstanding job you've done with this class. Not only did you teach them excellent combat techniques, but you also helped them understand what it means to be professional warriors." "Thank you, sir. It's been an honor working with such dedicated candidates. I have some news that I think you'll find interesting. The story of what happened in your first class has spread throughout the Special Operations community. I've received calls from training commands at Fort and the Air Force Special Operations School. They're all interested in having you conduct training seminars for their instructors and candidates." Sarah was surprised by this development. She had focused so intently on her daily responsibilities that she hadn't considered the broader impact of her work at. "Sir, I'm honored by their interest, but my primary responsibility is to the candidates here at the Naval Special Warfare Center." Smiled. "Actually, that's going to change. You've been selected for promotion to Lieutenant Commander, and you're being reassigned to develop a new curriculum for close-quarters combat instruction across all Special Operations units. Your techniques and teaching methods are going to become standard training for elite units throughout the military." The ceremony concluded with the traditional ringing of the bell, signifying the completion of another SEAL class. As families and friends congratulated the new graduates, several of the men approached Sarah to thank her for her instruction and leadership. Petty Officer was among them, but he hung back until the others had finished speaking with her. When he finally approached, his demeanor was completely different from the arrogant young man who had challenged her 3 months earlier. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for giving me a second chance after I acted like an idiot during that first class. The lessons you taught me went far beyond combat techniques. You helped me become a better person as well as a better warrior." Sarah shook his hand with genuine warmth. "You did the hard work of changing yourself, Petty Officer. I just provided some guidance along the way. I've been assigned to SEAL Team 3, and I promise you that I'll represent the values you taught us with honor and professionalism. The techniques you showed us could save our lives someday, but the character lessons you taught us will make us better leaders and teammates." As walked away to rejoin his family, Sarah reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come to simply to do her job as a combat instructor, but the challenge she had faced on her first day had opened doors to opportunities she never could have imagined. The incident had become legendary within military training circles, but not just because a small woman had defeated a larger man. The story resonated because it illustrated important principles about leadership, professionalism, and the qualities that made truly effective warriors. Sarah had demonstrated that combat effectiveness wasn't about physical dominance or intimidation. It was about mental discipline, technical skill, and the character to maintain professional standards even under pressure. Her willingness to give a second chance had shown that true strength included the wisdom to help others learn from their mistakes. A year later, Sarah was conducting a training seminar for Marine Corps instructors at. The audience included some of the most experienced combat veterans in the military, men and women who had served multiple deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. During a break in the training, a Marine gunnery sergeant approached her with a question that had become common during her seminars. "Ma'am, we've all heard the story about what happened during your first class at. Is it true that you knocked out a SEAL candidate with a single throw?" Sarah smiled at the question. The story had grown in the telling over the months, with some versions making it sound like a scene from an action movie rather than a training incident between professionals. The basic facts are accurate, Gunny. A candidate escalated a training exercise into actual violence, and I used his momentum against him to neutralize the threat. But the real story isn't about one physical technique. It's about the importance of maintaining professional standards and helping people learn from their mistakes. Roger that, ma'am. But I bet that technique comes in handy for smaller fighters facing larger opponents. The specific technique is useful, but the underlying principles are what really matter. Combat is about using your brain, not just your muscles. The strongest fighter in the world can be defeated by someone who thinks faster and maintains better tactical awareness. As Sarah continued her presentation to the Marines, she emphasized the same lessons she had taught to Class 347 and dozens of other groups since then. Physical strength was important, but mental discipline and technical knowledge were what separated truly elite warriors from ordinary soldiers. The presentation concluded with a practical demonstration where Sarah worked with volunteer Marines to show various techniques for dealing with larger opponents. The session was professional and educational, but Sarah could see the same look of respect in these Marines' eyes that she had earned from the SEAL candidates a year earlier. After the seminar, Sarah received a message that brought her career full circle. Commander, now promoted to captain, was requesting her return to serve as the senior instructor for all combat training programs at the Naval Special Warfare Center. The position would make her responsible for training not just SEAL candidates, but also the instructors who would teach future generations of special operations warriors. It was an opportunity to influence the development of America's most elite military units for decades to come. That evening, Sarah sat in her temporary quarters thinking about how much her life had changed since that morning when she first stepped off the helicopter. The challenge she had faced had tested her skills, her character, and her determination to succeed in a male-dominated environment. But the real victory hadn't been the throw that knocked unconscious. It had been earning the respect of her students through consistent professionalism, excellent instruction, and the wisdom to turn a confrontational situation into a learning opportunity for everyone involved. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from who was now serving with SEAL Team 3 in Afghanistan. "Ma'am, use the techniques you taught us during a mission last week. Your training probably saved my life and the lives of my teammates. Thank you for never giving up on me." Sarah smiled as she read the message. This was why she had chosen a career in military service, not for personal recognition or career advancement, but for the opportunity to make a positive difference in the lives of the warriors who defended their country. The next morning, Sarah submitted her acceptance of the position. She would return to where her journey as a special operations instructor had begun, but this time with the experience, reputation, and confidence that came from proving herself at the highest levels of military training. As she prepared for her return to the Naval Special Warfare Center, Sarah reflected on the lessons she had learned from her confrontation with. Challenge and conflict, when handled professionally, could become opportunities for growth and learning. Physical strength was important, but character, intelligence, and professionalism were what truly defined elite warriors. The story of the SEAL that week, who tried to strike her, would continue to be told in military training facilities around the world. But Sarah knew that the real legacy of that incident wasn't about one dramatic moment of physical confrontation. It was about the importance of maintaining standards, giving people second chances to prove themselves, and demonstrating that true strength came from the combination of technical skill, mental discipline, and moral character that defined the very best military professionals. Years later, when Sarah retired as a colonel after 30 years of military service, hundreds of special operations warriors would look back on her instruction as a defining influence in their careers. The techniques she taught would save lives in combat zones around the world, but more importantly, The example she set would inspire a generation of military leaders to maintain the highest standards of professionalism and character. The incident that had started with skeptical candidates, questioning whether a woman could effectively train SEALs, had evolved into a career that transformed how America's elite warriors were trained and developed. Sarah's legacy would be measured not just in the techniques she taught, but in the character and values she instilled in thousands of students who carried her lessons into the most challenging and dangerous missions their country could ask of them.